Today I want to show you guys how to use Substance Designer. This tutorial is for absolute beginners, and by the end you'll have made your first complete material from scratch. Don't know what Substance Designer even is? Well, if you're familiar with Substance Painter, have you ever wondered how they make those cool materials with all those customizable parameters? They do it with Designer. Now this program can get really complicated, but don't worry. In this first video, we'll just stick with the basics and create a simple tile material. You don't need anything besides the program to follow along, but if you want to check out my project files, I'm going to upload them to ProductionCrate for anyone with a free account. And if you have a pro account, I've uploaded that really cool brick building material that I just showed you as well. Alright, enough talk. Let's get started. Okay, so here we are in Substance Designer, and the first thing we want to do is open a new Substance graph. There are a ton of presets here, so pick the one that's best for your project, but if you scroll down here you can see which maps it's going to create. I'm going to stick with the basic metal roughness workflow. Be sure to name your project and press OK. Now at first glance this program is really confusing and looks more technical than artistic if you've never opened it before, but I'll give you a quick tour of the interface. Up here is our node graph, and if you've ever built a material in Blender or a program like that, this will make sense. These here are our output nodes, so anything that I plug into base color here will end up on the model. We've got the normal node, roughness, metallic, ambient occlusion, and height. And right now they have some basic sort of uniform colors plugged in. So if I were to go to the uniform color that's plugged into the base color and change that over here, you can see it's affecting the model. Down here we have our 3D view, and you control this by holding down Alt and using the 3 different mouse buttons to move the camera. If you hold down Control and Shift and use the right mouse button, you can change the light angle. Over here in the scene menu, you can change the piece of geometry that we're seeing, so I can use a rounded cylinder, I could do a plane, a piece of cloth if you're making fabric, but I'm going to stick with the rounded cube for now. And then over here we have the 2D view, which is going to show you whichever node you double click on. Over here on the right we have our parameters, which I already started using a little bit, but this is where you can adjust the settings for each node, and it's context sensitive, so I click on the normal node and you get different options. Over here is our file explorer, and you can see right now we just have one project. You may have multiple projects as you work more and more, but we're probably just going to kind of ignore this window. And you can even adjust the interface by dragging this up. And then lastly over here we have our library, and this is where we find all the nodes we need to create our materials. The most difficult thing about learning Substance Designer is sometimes you know what you want to do, but you don't know the name of the node, and so you don't know what to search for. So here we can actually search by categories. So if I click on blurs, here's all the different blur effects. Or if I go to normal map, here's a bunch of different normal map utilities, and so on. If you know the name of what you're looking for, you can just type it here, and this brings up any node that has the word blur in it. You can also right click and add node, and here's the most common ones. The most common ones are also up here at the top, so if you know what the icon looks like, you can just grab it really quickly here. But my favorite way, and probably the quickest way to access nodes, is just roll over this main node graph and press Tab or space, and then just type in what you need. And then you click on it, and you get your blur node. Alright, so that's the basics of the interface. So now let's start creating a basic brick wall material. So I like to start with the height channel or the normal map. Once you get your height information down and you get kind of the shape of your material, then you can use that to create all of your different colors and your roughness channel and your metallic and all that stuff. So I'm going to search for a node called Tile Generator, and this is a black and white image, and you zoom in, you can see that the edges are soft and kind of beveled. If I plug that into the normal node here, I can see on my model that I get these repeating squares with kind of round beveled edges. So that's the most important thing to keep in mind when we're creating these materials is the brighter a pixel is, the more it sticks out when you plug it into the normal channel and then eventually down here in the height channel. So we're going to try to create just an interesting black and white map, convert it to a normal map to get the detail of our brick wall, and then from there we'll create the color. So if I double click on my tile generator, there's a bunch of different options here. You can change the X amount of tiles, that's the number of tiles going left to right, or the Y amount. Here you can change what type of pattern it is. Right now it's set to brick, but you can do bell, which are just little soft blurred circles. You could do disc, which are hardened circles, but I'm going to stick with brick just for now. Notice that under the brick there's a pattern specific slider, and what this does is it either sharpens or softens up that gradient transition. You can also increase the variation, and if I increase the pattern specific, you can see that what that does is it randomly sets each tile to be more or less blurry, which is a pretty cool effect, but probably not what we're going for this video. And then if you scroll down, there's a ton more options which we'll get to when we need them. If I scroll back up to the top, you'll notice under pattern type, brick, there's one called image input. And if I click that, it just goes blank, and that's because there's no image plugged into the node. Over here on the left side of the node, I can see pattern input 1. This input is waiting for some sort of an image. So I'm actually going to create my own image for our tile, and you'll see why in just a minute here. So I'm going to press tab and I'm going to search for shape. So shape is just a white square, but I want a little bit of a black border on the edge of my square. So over here on the scale setting of my shape, I'm gonna click on 1 and I'm gonna type in 0.99. So we get just a tiny little bit of a black edge. Let's plug this into the input, and now you can see we kind of recreated the tile generator, but this is going to give us more control because we can do a lot of things to process this image and have it repeat on the tile generator. So one thing I want to do is I want these tiles to not be perfectly flat and even. I want them to slope a little bit. So it looks like one side or the other is sticking out a little bit. So to do that, we can create a gradient. I'll use gradient linear 1, and we need to blend these together. So I'm going to search for a blend node, and you can think of the blend node as like Photoshop layers. Notice we have a foreground and a background, and then over here we have blending mode. So we can choose multiply, screen, overlay, and all those familiar blending modes from Photoshop or After Effects. So let's plug the gradient on top there, and I'll plug my shape into the background, and then we'll plug this into the tile generator. And let's double click on blend and set the blending mode to multiply. So now we have the gradient and we have the little black border that we created with the shape node. Now the gradient is a little bit too intense. I don't want it to go from white to full black. So in my blend node, I'm going to turn the opacity down. I just want one side to be a little bit darker. Now if I look over here in the 3D view, I don't really see much difference. And if we look over here in the tile generator, that's because all of the gradients are kind of going the same direction. If I scroll down into the properties or parameters of this tile generator, I can see one called rotation random. And if I turn that up, you'll see that it's going to start randomly rotating the tiles until I turn it all the way up, and now they're all facing different directions. And that gives us this interesting result in the 3D view where the tiles don't seem perfectly even. It just seems a little more natural and realistic. I also want to bevel the edges of my tile a little bit and have some control over that. So I'm going to grab my shape node and let's search for bevel, and we'll drop this in between the shape and the blend. And if I go into the bevel, we have some settings here. I can go to my distance, and if I turn that down to a negative number, you can see we get some control over the beveling of these tiles. So I'm going to choose a very small number like minus 0.04. You can see that right here. You can also change the corner type if you want for a slightly different result, or you can increase the smoothing to sort of soften the transition from the bevel to the actual shape. So it just depends on what you're trying to do. Now I kind of want to create a sort of stylized, slightly damaged tile effect. So let's add some edge damage to these tiles. So here's my favorite way to add some damage and variation into some irregularities. And I'm going to use this a lot during this tutorial. I'm going to search for a node called slope blur, and we're going to do grayscale because we're not working with color yet. Let's plug our bevel node into the grayscale of the slope blur. And now it needs some sort of an image to be plugged into slope. So you can use whatever noise you want. I'm going to use Perlin noise. And let's plug the output into the blend node. So right now it looks a little bit crazy, but we can fix this. Go into the slope blur, let's turn the samples all the way up, and we'll turn the intensity down. And you can see we're getting some pretty intense chipping around the edge of these tiles. Now it's kind of destroying the edge of the tile. We can't see where it starts and stops. So let's change the mode from blur, and let's experiment with the two other modes. So if I go to min mode, you can see it preserves the edge of the tile. And if I go to max mode, it still preserves the edge of the tile, but in a slightly different way. I think I'm going to stick with min. Let's also turn the intensity way down to something like 0.1. So now we have some building blocks where we can really refine the edge of our tiles. I could increase or decrease the intensity. I can change the scale of the Perlin noise if I want smaller chunks or bigger, more subtle variations. In the bevel, I can play with the smoothing slider to create some sharp tiles, or maybe turn it way up and get some really soft tiles. And you just have full control. Okay, let's create some surface variation. So I'm going to grab the tile generator and everything and just move it to the left to make some room. And I'm going to search for a texture called Cells 1. This is a really cool texture for making stylized rocky surfaces. So first thing I want to do is invert this. So I'm going to drag this out and I'll search for invert. And now we have this sort of sharp peaked stylized rocky texture, kind of like chipped obsidian. Let's blend this over top of our tiles and just see what we get. So I'm using a blend node just like before. Plug this into the normal, and let's double click on the blend node and change the blending mode to overlay. So the overlay will preserve the edges that we created of the tiles, but add in these chipped raised surfaces. Now it's way too intense, so let's turn down the opacity. Or actually, let's keep it a little high right now because we're going to edit the way this looks and then we can turn it down later. So the first thing I want to do is kind of mess up these lines. They're too perfect and straight. So going from cells to inverted grayscale, let's add a new node and let's use that slope blur trick again. So I'm going to go slope blur grayscale, and then I'll add Perlin noise to the slope like this. It's way too crazy. Unless you want this look, it's looking a little bit too crazy for me. So I'm going to double click on my slope blur. We'll turn the samples way up, and let's set the mode to min. See what that does for us. Okay, I'm going to turn down the intensity. Okay, I think I'm going to click on my Perlin noise and increase the scale over here. Go back to my slope blur, and I'll turn the intensity again way down to maybe 0.1. So now we have another problem is it kind of seems like the pattern is jumping from one tile to the next because it feels like the entire thing is projected over top of these tiles, and that's exactly what's happening. And that wouldn't really happen because these tiles are supposed to look natural, so we don't really want to see cracks and bumps flowing from one tile to the next. So what we can do is randomly push this texture around a different amount on each tile. So let me show you how that's done. I'm gonna make some room here, and let's create a node called Warp Directional. We'll plug the slope blur into the input of the warp directional, and then we need a black and white image to warp this image by different amounts per pixel. And if I want each tile to be shifted a different amount, what I need is another tile generator. Okay, let's set the pattern for this one to square so that there are no edges. And it's really important that if you change the setting of your tile generator in terms of the X amount and the Y amount, you need to set this tile generator to the same so that it lines up. So let's say you have 20 squares going vertical and only 5 going horizontal. You've got to set the same setting on this tile generator so that it lines up. And now we're going to scroll way down, almost to the bottom, and I'm going to increase luminance random almost all the way up like this. So now we have a grid of squares that are all different values, and we can plug this into the intensity input of our directional warp. And then I'll plug the directional warp node into the top layer of the blend, and we'll see that the cracks and bumps are starting to shift. If we go into the directional warp and increase the intensity, we can see that organic pattern shifting differently on each tile. We can also change the angle. So if I turn this here, it'll shift them diagonally or vertically or whichever direction you want. I'm also going to turn the intensity slider up higher than it can go. It kind of stops at 20, but you can type in a higher number like say 500. That's just going to make sure that it's completely random and that these cracks don't line up with each other. Okay, our node graph is getting pretty complex, so let's take a second to talk about some organization. So first thing, if you click on nodes, you can press D for dock. And if you know you're not going to need them again, that could be a good way to clean up your interface. To undock them, you just press D again. It's also helpful to just manually sort of arrange these so that no lines are crossing, because this can get pretty confusing if things aren't arranged properly. So make sure that these things are laid out in a way that makes sense visually. And another quick tip for organization is creating groups of nodes or frames. So up here, these nodes here are creating the random organic surface, and these nodes are creating my tiles. So I'm going to select these nodes here, and we'll right click and go add frame. And you can see this text field is live over here on the right. I'm going to name it tiles. And you can actually click on the word tiles and just drag it around. Let's do the same thing here. I'll select these nodes and I'll right click, add frame, and call this surface variations. Very cool. So I'm going to quickly add one more layer of surface variation before we move on to color and roughness. I want to create some cracks in the surface. So for that, I'm going to use a texture called Cells 3. And this is a very faint texture, but if you zoom in really close over here in the 2D window, you can see it gives you some hairline cracks. So let's blend this on top of our blend node there. I'm going to create blend, and I'll plug Cells 3 into the foreground, and I'll plug this blend node into the background. And then we'll plug the whole thing into the normal. So now we just see the cracks, but that's because we need to go into the blend node and change it to multiply. And now we've got cracks on the surface. They look a little too perfect and computer generated, so let's mess them up a little bit. And for that, I'm just going to do that same slope blur trick again. So I'm going to search for slope blur, grayscale. And for the slope, I'm going to use Perlin noise again, and we'll plug that into the top node there. Let's go into the slope blur node here, and I'm going to increase the samples just like before and turn the intensity way down. Okay, and next we can experiment with changing the modes. So we can go from blur to min, that gives us one result. We can go to max, and that gets us a different result. I'm going to set it to min really quick and just leave it there for a second while we experiment. We can go to the Perlin noise and change the scale, and that'll give us different results. We can also go to the slope blur and mess with the samples and the intensity. We can also go over to the cells node and change the scale and the hardness there. So if you want bigger or smaller cracks, we can do this. Hardness will increase or decrease the intensity. And then over here in the blend node, we can turn the opacity way down so it's not so crazy. I'm going to turn my scale down a little bit so I get bigger cracks. Okay, now we have the same problem we had with the surface variations where these cracks look like they're going from one tile to the next. And that doesn't really make sense because the tiles are separate objects. So I'm going to do that same trick with the directional warp. Let's search for directional warp, plug the node into the input, and then we can actually just use this same tile generator again for the intensity input. We don't have to create another one. Now in this directional warp, I'm going to go and change the intensity to something like 600, and we'll plug that into the blend. So now the cracks don't line up. You can see right here, this crack stops at this tile. It doesn't continue into the next tile, which is good. Now, another thing is, it kind of feels like these cracks are just kind of uniform everywhere, and I want some areas where there's no cracks at all. So over here in this last blend node on the far right over here, we can see that there's one last input node called opacity. We can actually plug a black and white texture in here to mask out the entire effect. So let's experiment with using some different black and white textures as masks. I'm gonna search for the word grunge, and you can see there are tons of really interesting grunge patterns here. I'm just gonna grab this one. I don't really know what it's gonna look like. Okay, that's actually pretty cool. And we can plug this into the opacity, and the darker pixels are gonna remove the cracks in those areas. In this grunge texture, we can increase the contrast, and we can see it's removing some of the cracks in certain areas. If you adjust the balance, you get more cracks, or if you turn the balance down, you get fewer cracks. Once again, you can go back to the other nodes that you previously made to adjust those settings. So if I go into this blend node here, I can turn the opacity down, and I can still change the intensity of the cracks. I can also go and find cells 3 and change the scale if I want smaller cracks. So all this stuff is still live, and you can still adjust it after the fact. Okay, let's clean this up a little bit. I'm going to select these nodes here, and I'll create a frame, and I'll call it cracks. Okay, I think our height information is done. I think we can start moving on to color and roughness. So the first node I usually create when I'm done with my height and my normal, and I'm ready to start working on the other channels, is curvature. So the curvature comes out of the normal node here. So if I drag this out, I can search for curve, and there's actually two of them. There's curvature and then curvature smooth. I'll show you what they both look like, and you can choose which one you like best for your project. So curvature looks like this when you zoom in, and you can see it's just showing the sharpest points of the model, highlighted as a lighter color, and the deepest points are black. Curvature smooth is very similar, but it's just slightly softened, so it depends on the look you're trying to go for. There's no right answer, they both have their uses, it's really just up to you which one you want. So if I zoom out on curvature smooth, you can see we get some really interesting color variation in the tiles, the gradients going in all different directions. And if I click on the basic curvature one, I can see that overall the image is more flat, it just has some sharper details. So we can actually use both of these in the future. And I think I'll just kind of leave them here so I can access them whenever I want. This is getting a little crowded, so I'm going to grab all of these nodes and just drag them to the right to make some room. Just for visibility's sake, I'm going to click on the uniform color that's going into roughness, and I'm going to turn up the value so that the surface becomes a little bit more rough. Okay, cool. So here's my favorite way of creating color if you really don't know what to do next, or if you don't need a specific color. Here's a fun and interesting way to generate some color very quickly. I'm going to search for gradient map, and I'll plug one of these into the gradient map. Let's start with the curvature smooth, and then I'll plug that into the base color output. We can trash this uniform color for now. Now we can see that the color of the model actually has some variation based on this image here. But with this gradient map, what we can do is go to edit gradient, and just like in Photoshop, we can remap these values to certain colors. So let me just show you an extreme example. If I click here on the black side and change that to red, all the black pixels become red. If I click in the middle and change that to green, all the gray pixels become green. And then over here on the right, if I change that to blue, all the white pixels become blue. And you can move these around and make all kinds of adjustments. But the really cool thing is down here, we have this option called Pick Gradient. And we can click on this and just drag our mouse across different colors, even in the interface. So if I drag this mouse across all these colors here, it'll pick all of those colors that I dragged over. Or I can go Pick Gradient and just drag it across these buttons here, looking pretty crazy. Let's actually search for the word brick. And you can see there are some brick nodes here, some brick materials, but I can actually just click on Pick Gradient and just steal these colors. And now we have an interesting brick color. And it's really fun and kind of addictive to just do this over and over because it's like a slot machine. You just get a different result every time. Now, you don't have to just pick these colors from the interface. You can get pictures from anywhere. So here I've got some pictures I found online of different colored tiles. And just as a quick note, this program I'm using to put pictures over my interface is called PureRef. It's pretty cool. So let's move this out of the way, and I'll pick maybe some blue colors here. Some interesting blue variations. Let's try some extreme variation. That's actually pretty interesting. If I want to try a terracotta look, I can come over here and grab these red bricks. That one's kind of subtle. That's pretty cool. And then I've also got some pretty cool green examples. I actually really like this one. It's got some damaged edges. Maybe it's a little too subtle though, so let's try again. There we go. That's pretty interesting, right? It's just a happy accident. Okay, let's adjust the roughness channel now. So you can try using these curvatures as your roughness. Let's see what that looks like. But if you know anything about texturing, you know that the brighter something is, the less shiny it is, and the darker it is, the more shiny it is. So right now the deep recesses are shiny and these high edges are not shiny. So I probably want to invert this. I'm going to search for invert grayscale and we'll run it through that first. And I also want to be able to adjust the levels of shininess. So let's also create a levels node. And now we can lighten the image to make it less shiny or darken the image to make it more shiny. From here we can add tons more roughness variation. I'm not going to go too crazy with it, but let me just show you one example of something you could try. So I'm going to search for a node called moisture noise, and you can see that this one kind of looks like water spots. It's pretty cool. So let's create a blend node and blend this on top of our existing roughness map. I'm going to set the blend mode to overlay, and I'm going to turn down the opacity so it's just a little bit of variation. I don't want to get too crazy. But if you look right here where the shine is happening on these tiles, you can see it's just breaking it up a little bit if I slowly increase the opacity. It does make it a little bit less shiny, so you can compensate by going back to levels and maybe darkening the original image some more. Let's group these 4 nodes here and call this roughness. Now I actually want to add some grout in between each tile. And I just want to do this really quick to show you how powerful this program is and how nothing is ever set in stone. You can always go back and make changes. So I'm going to scroll back to where my normal node is, and I want to make some space to the left of that. So I'm going to search for a node called Grunge Rough Dirty, and this is going to be the base of our dirt. Let's just plug it into the normal to test how it's going to look. Pretty cool. I'm going to add a couple little pebbles and rocks to it as well. So let's search for another node called Dirt 1, and this is what this node looks like. Little rocks, pretty cool. Let's blend those together really quick, and then I'll plug that into the normal channel, and let's set the blending mode to screen. Okay, so that's going to be the basis of our dirt. Let's create a frame for it so we don't lose it. And what we're going to do is blend our tiles together with our dirt, but we're going to do it in a way that we haven't done before. This is a really powerful technique. So I'm going to search for height blend, and you can see there's 2 inputs, height top and height bottom. Now the dirt's going to go below the tiles, so we're going to move this down below, plug this into height bottom, plug the tiles into height top, and then we'll plug blended height into the normal. And you can see what's happening is it's blending the dirt based on the height of the tiles. And we can adjust this with the height offset slider. So if I turn it up, the tiles will move upward or the dirt will move backwards until it's just between each tile. Or if you want sort of a messy ground tile look, you can lower the height offset and you can see some of the dirt is sort of spilling out onto the ground, which could also be a pretty cool look. Now the dirt itself needs its own color, right? So over here where my color is being created, I'm going to create a uniform color node just for a quick test. We're not going to keep this node, so just pick a sort of dirt looking color and we'll use it to test out our effect. Let's put this below our gradient map, which is driving the color of the tiles, and we'll create a blend and we'll connect these together. And then for the opacity, we're actually going to use this height mask that comes out of the height blend node over here that we created. And this will mask off the dirt. Let's plug this into the base color and see what happened. And now the dirt has its own color. And once again, if I adjust the height offset within the height blend node, the color map will dynamically update and it looks like the dirt's sort of spreading out from the ground. Okay, this is kind of a boring color for dirt though, so let's really quickly create a more interesting color map for the dirt. So I'm going to delete this uniform color and we'll create another gradient map, plug this into the background. For the input of this new gradient map, we're going to grab the blended height, the top node here from this height blend. And then inside of gradient map, we're going to pick some interesting brown colors. So I'm going to grab gradient editor. And then over here, remember I searched for the word brick. I can just sample some of these browns by clicking pick gradient and just sample some brown colors like that. Again, you can keep trying over and over until you get an interesting look. All right, that's good enough. Another thing is this dirt is too shiny. It kind of looks like wet mud. So we need to also adjust the roughness of the dirt. I'm going to keep it simple and just use a uniform color for that. So if I move over here to my roughness frame, I'm going to scooch things over and make some room. I'll add a uniform color. We'll set it to grayscale and I'm going to turn the value up pretty high because we want the dirt to not be very shiny. And now we'll add a blend node and I'll put the uniform color below into the background and the original roughness into the foreground. And then for this opacity, we're going to zoom way out and grab the height mask from the height blend node. And then we'll plug this into roughness. So now the dirt is not shiny. Now maybe it's a little too rough, so we can go back to our uniform color and turn that down a little bit. And now you can see the dirt has a different roughness value from the tiles. So now we have a bunch of building blocks where you can make as many variations as you want. Let's say I want this to be a little bit cleaner. I can increase the height offset again and sort of put that dirt back in the deep recesses. Let's say we want this to be bathroom tiles, so the grout should be sort of a white color instead. Well, we can go back to our gradient map for the dirt and just pick some gray values here, like that. Maybe we decided that we do want some brown, sort of terracotta bathroom tile after all. And maybe we want it to be a little bit less shiny. So we can go back to our levels node down in our roughness frame and adjust some sliders. So you can create all kinds of variations of these materials and flesh out an entire scene. When you're all done with your material and you're ready to export, we can go over here to the Explorer and we can see this is our brick example. Open that up, you can see the output images. We can right click and go export outputs. You can choose which maps to export. So for example, we didn't really create height or ambient occlusion, so we can turn those off. You can click here to navigate where you want to export the textures and just push export outputs. And it says exporting in the background and it's done. And now we can apply our material in Blender to see what it looks like. So I'm going to click on the default cube and I'm not going to delete it. Go up to the shading tab. Notice we got our default material here. I'm going to press Ctrl-Shift-T and we'll navigate to where we save those textures, select all of them, press enter, and now we've got our material on our model in Blender. Okay, and that's it. That's the basics of Substance 3D Designer. Thanks for watching, and if this sort of content interests you, be sure to leave a comment so we can make more videos like this. And when you're ready to get really advanced, I recommend one of these pro courses by the artist named Javier Perez. He's a true master of Substance Designer. And as always, if you make anything cool with this tutorial, be sure to tag us on Instagram with it or share it to the Discord. Alright, later creators.